This could be one of those videos where I tell you all the things I love about Bardsung, and then halfway through the video I go into a twist of all the things it does wrong. But I'll save you the time. Bardsung does do a lot of things right, but at the end of the day, for me, the payoff isn't worth it. Hey, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co., and today I'm reviewing... I don't even know whether to call this a review or first impressions. I'm covering Bardsung today. I'm covering Bardsung, and I say I don't know whether to call it review or first impressions because I'm 15 hours into this, which seems like enough time to call something a review, but I also have barely scratched the surface, so maybe it's a first impressions. I'll let you decide. I'll figure out later what to do about the title, but you can decide how much to take out of that experience. And this is going to not follow the usual format of my reviews. I'm going to cover a lot of things, the general gameplay structure, how it works, what the point of it all is, and then I'll tell you the things that I really liked about Bardsung and why I find myself wanting to like this game more than I do, but I also will tell you the ways it doesn't work for me. The things it does that make it so that this is a game that's not sticking around, despite my interest in seeing how my characters grow, how my characters develop, despite my interest in diving into the expansions, the other characters, the other stories. I like the story, I like the adventure, I'm diving into the things I like. Let's take a step back. Bardsung is a dungeon crawling experience in which you're going to be wandering through a dungeon, or a variety of dungeons as the case may be. In fact, let's go ahead and open up the adventure book. You're going to be wandering through the dungeon, you're going to be going on adventures, you're going to be leveling up your characters, you're going to be taking down baddies, you're going to be going through the story, you're going to be making choices and decisions, and all along the way, it's a classic dungeon crawler. Roll dice, defeat bad guys attack you, you try to defend. That's the core concept. If you've played a dungeon crawler, this will have a lot of the same high notes as a dungeon crawler does, a lot of the same notes in general that a dungeon crawler does. If you have not played a dungeon crawler, this may well be a good entry dungeon crawler for you. There's a lot of reasons why Bardsung is not for me, but those reasons may or may not apply to you. I recommend waiting to find out. So, you're going to open up this chapter selection, going here, read the story, starting off the bat. You'll go through all of that. There is a foreteller app as well if you prefer that. You're going to go through all this, and you're going to start making choices from the very get-go once you're done with all the rules. And there's rule books to go through. There's a pretty accessible rule book. One of my pros of the game is that the rule book is very easy to read. Although I've heard people complain about it, I found it very simple. But either way, going through this over here, you're going to start off, you're going to go through a bit of a how to read through this dungeon guide, and then you're going to start off, read some more text, and from the get-go, make a decision of which way to go. Let's say you go to Chapter 2 over here. You go to Chapter 2, you go to the Hobgoblin encampment. You're going to go through a bit of a progression of reading these symbols over here of how to go through a sequence of adventures. Each sequence of adventures is going to play out on this giant, way too large board. That is one of my many complaints about Bardsung. This board is too large. But it's also necessary for the experience unless you draw out some sort of map on your table. What I have right now, the way it's set up right now, not the way I've played the game, not the way you should play the game, but the way it does nicely fit into the top camera shot, so take that with a grain of salt as well. You'll be playing out this gigantic board. This is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 9 folds. This is 9 folds, which means it's going to be like this, and like this, and like this, and then another 5 more folds on top of that. This board takes up your entire table, and you will need more space than just the board to play this game because you have trays of miniatures, you have trays of tokens, you have cards, you have tiles. This game takes up a lot of table space. But from there, you're going to go ahead and set that board out, and you'll start going on these adventures. And the adventures follow different routes depending on what adventure you're going through, depending on the scripted encounter, or the types of encounters you're going to have, depending on whether you're doing a boss fight. There will always be differences, but the core concept is wander to a certain point of the dungeon, exploring tiles as you go, grabbing cards from these rooms and corridors decks. The rooms are going to lead into corridors, the corridors are going to lead into rooms, and you're going to be putting down, you have the starting room, the starting entranceway, you put down a corridor, you put down a room, you put down a corridor, you put down a room, you put down a corridor, a room. You're going to be slowly chaining across the dungeon, and whenever you can't put something down, you just don't. If you can't put something down, if there's no space on the board, if it winds into something else, then that pathway is closed off. You'll have your standard openings and closings. You'll have these over here that you can spend toolkits to go ahead and go through, spending a rune and a toolscape to go ahead and go through those as well. You'll have a whole bunch of options. These will tell you what enemies to spawn and how to go through them. They'll also tell you whether to draw these battle cards or these cards instead. You're going to have the different types of cards, either narrative cards or battle cards, giving you different modifiers for whatever's happening on the table. As those enemies spawn, you're going to be going back to that book over there and looking at the key. Another one of my complaints about Bardsung is, as you go through these over here, you'll have, let's say, these little keys you're going through that show, depending on which symbols you draw, let's go ahead and draw the card again, let's draw this one over here, this room, depending on the symbols you have here, you'll reference the key that you have for the room. All very easy, except it's kind of tedious and annoying, and it changes all the time to whatever's going on, And this book is another thing you now have to have set up on the table in front of you. The table space for Bardsung is not a small ask. It is not a small commitment as far as just how much you have to fit onto your table. A giant board with 9 squares, a rulebook open, multiple trays of miniatures, multiple trays of tokens, dice, cards, miniatures, tiles. There's a lot. Your heroes over here, I haven't even fully displayed their items because I just don't have the room to do so. They're going to have their weapons on one side, their skills on another. There's a ton of table space going on. Maybe the sequencing of like and not like is getting mixed in here, but I am going through my experience with Bardsung. From there, you actually have the enemies that spawn. And you're going to have an initiative row. You're going to be putting down your cards, the enemy's cards, into an initiative row in which they're going to go back and forth, taking their actions on the initiative row. And when you complete the cycle, when you're done with the cycle, you shuffle the whole thing up. Yet another small complaint is the fact that these cards, you have to kind of look away as you do so, because not only are your hero cards different colors, the enemies sometimes are double-sided. So you're constantly doing this over here, which is not the end of the world. Honestly, from the various things I'll talk about, that's a small minor complaint. You'll create the initiative row and you'll take your actions, taking your actions in turn, trying to take down the enemies using your actions. You'll have basic attack actions you can utilize. You'll have different weapons and spells and things you'll utilize as your attack. You'll be moving around the dungeon at the same time, trying to escape, rolling for escape penalties as the enemies try to attack you. Rolling your dice to see whether you hit, whether you connect, weighing yourself up against their initiative over there with the modifiers of your weapon, with the modifiers of your roll. And then when you connect, when you actually connect, you go ahead and do a damage roll, which will, the die you roll depends on the character. They're all going to have different stats as far as how they determine whether they got a critical or not, what they did. Meanwhile, the enemies are attacking you, and you're rolling defense. You're rolling defense modified by your defense stat, and as you take wounds, you'll slowly put them down on your board up to your health until eventually you collapse in the dungeon. The good news is the game's not over, at least not over yet. You do have a certain number of deaths or ways you can actually fall apart, and you have campfires and rest tokens and spawn points and all these things, but the core concept, the core gameplay loop of Bardsung is look through the adventure, make a choice, go down a pathway, try to find some treasure, get upgraded experience points based on the specific adventure you're going through, take down enemies along the way, earning coins for their defeat, using those coins to pay for other things such as resetting some of your tokens, and then continuing the cycle of beating up enemies as they attack you through the dungeon as you level up your characters. Occasionally there'll be boss fights to intersperse the experience and mix it up a bit, but past that, any single adventure might have anywhere from 2 to 5 dungeon crawls in order to actually progress through it. And that's where I don't like Bardsung. That's the biggest part of Bardsung that pushes me away from the experience. There's a lot of table space requirement. There's the not insignificant cost of the game itself. But for me, the biggest one of those things, for me, the biggest of those three, is the fact that the grind of the experience is not worth the ever so rewarding payoff of building up your characters. And it is ever so rewarding. To be very clear, building up my characters has been tremendously satisfying, earning those experience points across the party, spending them on stat boosts so you can roll better against the ever-increasing stronger enemies you'll be dealing with, spending them on skills, the stat boosts are honestly kind of boring, but they are essential, spending them on skills that give you specific aspects that you can do, charging across the dungeon a Stoneheart in order to be able to take 3 movements before your attack and swinging, being able to roll +3 against lone enemies when I'm playing as Nightfeather, taking down solo enemies that are wandering off on the dungeon on their own, being able to completely tank them because I just am stronger against them in the dark of the night. Being able to jump around the board with Light Weavers, casting spells, increasingly stronger spells, building up the characters. You have giant, where are they? Giant decks. Are they over here? They're somewhere over here. Is it just over here? We have giant decks full of all these upgrades, 2-sided upgrades you can level up, different ways you can build out and upgrade your characters, and I haven't gotten to see so much of them just yet. I've upgraded some of my starting abilities, I've added some new abilities, I've upgraded some of their stats so they can roll better and stop missing when I'm trying not to miss, but there's so much fun in building out a solid character. The core gameplay loop, though, is not as rewarding. When you go through a dungeon, it feels like the payoff of the character that you've been building. It feels like the process of you've spent time, you've earned those things, you've used your experience points, and you've got there and you've gotten that cool new ability. And now you can combo together. Now Lightweave is doing extra damage against enemies with condition tokens on them, which is lots of fun. But you have to sit there and now go through the process. You go through the dungeon, you spend 45 minutes to an hour and a half in a dungeon, and then you go through another dungeon, and then you go through another dungeon, and you earn a few experience points. And so you upgrade one of your stats. And then you go through another hour and a half, and another hour and a half, and another hour and a half, and you upgrade another card. The process of gaining experience in Bardsung is slower than the payoff that gives me. the actual gameplay decisions, while they do grow more intricate, and perhaps if I'm 30 hours in, they'd grow even more intricate still. But as of right now, Bardsung does not offer me a level of depth to the individual playthroughs that make it worth 4.5 hours of experience before I get to the next cycle of earning something new. The next cycle of something fun. And again, it absolutely could be that changes as I go through the game. The boss fights as well. I've only encountered 2 bosses so far, so again, take it with a grain of salt. That's what 15 hours will buy you so far. But the bosses are nice. They're a nice change of pace. They mix up the experience a bit. I appreciate them. But it's the same problem as everything else. Bardsung does a lot of things well. And there's piles of stuff. There's piles of content to go through. And like we have these giant stacks of cards that I will never get to see. Stacks full of cards to go through. Enemies that I have not come close to touching. Skills and abilities and weapons and upgrades and gear and treasure. All the fun things that I've dabbled in and gotten a taste for. They're all there. All the things Bardsung does well, it does well. I like the experience. I want to like this game more than I do. The story is fun and engaging. The choices you're making as you go through it. There's a lot to... I mean, story's relative. I guess it depends what you're looking for. I like the type of story that I get here. Just enough agency to feel like I'm wandering around and making choices. Just enough story points to feel like I'm getting a taste for why I'm in these dungeons, why everything's attacking me, what's happening. I like the thickness of this book and what it gives me. I don't like the amount of game time it gives me. And this is where it may differ for you. Understand that for me, my experience with Bardsung has been almost exclusively solo. I dove into it initially with 2 players. Initially, I started off the bat with 2 players, controlling 2 characters each and diving into the dungeon. Another small point is, unless I'm missing something, the game seems to balance between 3 characters and 4 versus 5, but between 4 versus 5, there seems to be no scaling, so unless I'm missing something, 4 is just inherently harder than 5. Which is fine, it's not the end of the world, I guess it's a way of scaling the game yourself. But either way, I dove into it initially with 4 players. 4 characters, 2 players. And then realized very quickly that we weren't going to tackle Bardsung enough together for me to treat this as a 2-player game. And so over the past month, I've pulled out here, I've pulled it out there, I've gotten another play-in, and what started off as the first 5 to 10 hours, very quickly in the first week and a half, has slowly tapered down. As I grew less excited to go through the chore of another dungeon, another series of 3 dungeons, as I grew less enamored with what would happen next and the changes there would be. And there is. As you go to the next page and the next page and the next page, there are changes. It just takes a while to get there. And for me, the point at which I decided to do this review was the point at which I felt that diving back in again, I would either be forced to choose between cheating, between skipping a whole bunch of stuff and starting to level up my characters on my own just to, in order to experience that next thing, or just not enjoy myself. Bardsung for me started off strong, and I think there's a lot of elements in there that are rewarding. And if you're more okay with the grind, I think this is something that might not scare you off. I didn't love the grind. I didn't love the repetition. And I do prefer, for myself, if I'm going to dive into a campaign game or a solo game, anything of those things, and it's worth noting my bias there. In general, campaign games have always been a mixed bag. I love them in theory, but in execution, I have a harder time playing them. Although even as we speak, I'm in the middle of going through Resident Evil 3 from Steamforged Games and having a lot of fun with it. So it's not exclusive. But for me, if I'm going to experience a campaign game, I want to be approaching it regularly. Because if I let it pace itself out across years, across who knows how much time, I just won't fully experience it. And diving into Bardsung has moved from something that I enjoyed and looked forward to something that was less exciting. So where am I with this one? I mixed together the whole what I like, don't like, and see others not liking. I threw it all together. I think for final thoughts on Bardsung, let's just package it all together into one little conversation. I want to like Bardsung. I want to like it a lot more than I do. There are so many elements here that I am going to miss. This stack of skills, I've gone through some of them to see what I'm missing out on, and I am so intrigued. I've gone through some of the expansion characters to see what they do, and I am so intrigued. I have not gone through all the rooms and corridors and story that I haven't touched upon. I don't know why I haven't, but I haven't. But I am so intrigued. Bardsung does a lot of things that are very rewarding, and it does a lot of things well. It is simple, it is engaging, it is a lot of fun when it is hitting those high points. But I feel the amount of gameplay between the leveling up, I feel it was tripled. I feel it was 3 times what it needed to be. Although that experience might vary depending on who you are. If you're okay with a more slow-paced, methodical approach with unlocking another room and another room and another corridor, meeting another story card and going through that again and again and again, or maybe if I hit 20, 25, 30 hours, maybe the amount of skills and complexity that it gives me is enough that I feel rewarded for diving into yet another dungeon. As it is, for me, every dungeon represents an opportunity to try the new build that I just created, to try the new skill, the adjusted stats. All of that is an opportunity to dive into it. But the amount of time it takes before I get the next skill is just too much of an ask. And when you combine that with the table space this demands, I think Bardsung's a solid game. I'm going to give it a 3.5 out of 5, which after everything I said might sound a little much. I almost feel like maybe it's a 3, maybe it's a 2.5. I don't know where it is, but for me, my rating has always been a 3. The difference between a 3.5 and a 3 for me has always been the idea of, is there a part of me that's sad to not fully experience what I'm leaving behind? And Bardsung absolutely has that. There are many, many elements here that I wish the game had approached the grind differently, so I could get all the parts I like without feeling like Bardsung has turned into a homework assignment. And that's where I am with this one. As far as other game recommendations, Gloomhaven is going to be a consistent, regular approach game. Gloomhaven in general gives you a consistent delivery of an experience that offers enough strategy room to room that while it does give you that same level of grind and the very slow-paced experience gain, the actual challenge you're making room to room is significantly more rewarding. The actual choices you're making in any individual instance, I personally find significantly more rewarding. And if you want something with a little bit less gameplay changes, that is from actually Steamforged Games, speaking of which, I'll go with Resident Evil 3. Resident Evil 3, I'm currently diving into it. I'm currently like 6 or 7 missions deep, and I'm just looking forward to the next one, and the next one, and the next one. And there's no real end in sight there. Until next time, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co. I hope you enjoyed this video, and as always, have a good one.